Thank you, everyone, for getting here early, and thank you so much for the beautiful presentations last night, as well as the speech. So thank you. I was just so excited and very, very proud of all of your work. We're going to begin today with our first panel, and Holly will introduce that panel. But before we start, just a couple of announcements. And the first one is that, as you know, we are live streaming the event. Yesterday, there were many, many people who were watching. I was very pleased to find that out, and I think some of you told me that you had heard from friends and family and faculty and other people about your presentations. So the live stream is great, and thank you, Mark, for that. It's I realized that I could watch part of it this morning, so it was still live, I guess. And we will be also posting it as a video during the week, so it will be available to everyone. And I also want to thank Jeff. Yes.
This would be a good moment to notify your communities that we're live. If you're,
Yes. Yeah. So if you have your phones with you, and you probably all do, please send a text or email to remind people to watch. And I think you have the links in an email from me. Yes. Or Holly. So tell them to watch because it looks really good. And I also want to thank Jeff for the millions of tweets, and all of you here, like there were many of you who were also tweeting, and that's great. Keep tweeting. Did everyone bring the social media packet? Yeah. If we have extra copies.
So we have extras on the table out there as well as extra schedules.
And so after the panel, if you want to pick up schedules for the day and social media handles, they're outside on that sheet. Also, as I'm sure everybody saw, we have water and coffee and wonderful food. Please silence your cell phones. And the restrooms are that way. So you go down the hall and you'll find them. But head in that direction. And I'll now turn it over to Holly. So thank you.
Hi everyone, good morning. I hope you all got enough sleep. So it's really great to see all of you this morning. I was getting a little worried. But I'm really glad we're all here. I'm really excited for our first panel. Just as a reminder, this is a panel with some of our wonderful grantees and a wonderful person from National Geographic as well, on reporting with regards to cultural sensitivity. So I just wanted to begin kind of with an introduction of each panelist so that you have an idea, and then I'll let them formally introduce themselves, give us idea of what you're doing now, your work, and I'd love for you to tell us about a time in which you reported in a situation where you had to be culturally sensitive. So to start, I'm just going to go from your right to your left. Melissa Noel is a freelance multimedia journalist in New York City. She produces video as well as print and online stories for several outlets, including NBCNews.com, Caribbean Beat Magazine, and Voices of New York. Noel's work focuses on telling stories that center on the issues impacting marginalized communities and the Caribbean diaspora. She's earned a Global Media Award for Excellence in Reporting from the International Labor Organization, a Shining Star Award in Journalism from Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and a White House Correspondents Association Journalism Award. Moving along now to Phillip Martin. Phillip Martin is the senior investigative reporter for WGBH News and a contributing reporter for PRA's The World, a program which he helped develop as a senior producer in 1995. Phillip worked as a supervising senior editor for NPR West and was NPR's first national race relations correspondent from 1998 to 2001. His Pulitzer Center supported project is a multi-platform journalistic investigation into casteism in the United States and Canada. It explores a, quote, form of theopolitical stratification that manifests as discrimination against some and privilege and exclusivity for others. Moving along to Gabrielle Ewing. Gabrielle is a digital video producer at National Geographic. Her explainers and short documentaries have earned awards from the Society of Publication Designers, the Webby Awards, the Online Journalism Awards, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist nomination. Gabrielle obtained her BFA in Film and Television from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, with a second major in journalism. While at NYU, she was a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar and interned at CNN's documentary unit and NBC New York. Gabrielle is currently working on a mobile-first TAP story about autism and a limited series about how everyday objects become plastic. Now to Jacqueline Charles, whom we heard speak last night. Jacqueline Charles began her journalism career at the Herald as a 14-year-old high school intern before graduating from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Now she's the Herald's Caribbean correspondent. Jacqueline's assignments have taken her through the Caribbean, as well as Liberia, Kenya, Italy, and most recently Mexico, Canada, and Chile to report on the struggles faced by Haitian migrants. And on the end here we have Jaime Joyce. Jaime is executive editor at Time for Kids, Time Magazine's news edition for students. Her most recent Pulitzer Center supported project introduces readers to children of incarcerated parents who overcome many obstacles in order to remain connected. Jaime traveled with children on bus trips across the state of California to spend time with their mothers and fathers in prison, and to Camp Suzanne, which brings children and mothers together for a week-long visitation. So would you just join me in welcoming them first? Yeah. So we've got a great group of folks here, and I think they're going to each start with a little introduction. Melissa and Phillip gave me some photos and things to start off their introduction, so I think Melissa is going to start whenever you're ready.
All right. Should I stand? I think I'll stand. I think that might be helpful. Okay, so you heard a little bit about me.
You gotta either be at that mic or take your mic.
Okay, I'll stand here. So I'm Melissa Noel. I'm currently a television correspondent for One Caribbean Television and their affiliates in the Caribbean, ABC, USBI, and their CBS stations. And I still do contribute to NBC News. And in these roles, I do travel throughout the Caribbean region, reporting on stories from culture to mental health, and you kind of name it, I've done it in the region. But my Pulitzer supported project really focused on the impact of parental migration on the mental health of Caribbean children. And so doing this kind of story really required me to have sensitivity in a lot of ways, not only to the economic situations of the families, but also to what was happening to children who were left behind by their parents, and who actually moved away to actually better support their families. And these children are referred to as Beryl Children. And so you see this picture right here is of a barrel, and barrels are shipping containers that are typically used to send goods to the Caribbean. It's an inexpensive way to do it, and utilizing barrels is something that culturally in the Caribbean is very normal, something that I even do to send barrels to my family in Guyana, and it's often looked at as a way of sending love. So it was something that I always thought about as very positive, because you pack a barrel with clothing, you pack a barrel with food, you pack a barrel with things that your family members would love and enjoy. But I had never thought about how that same barrel could actually represent something that was negative to children or negative to a family until I got into this story. So for a lot of the children that I interviewed, including this young man right here who was actually like sitting on a barrel, but this young man, his name is Tijon, and he at the time was 12 years old. Tijon is 14 now. So interviewing him, he himself wasn't a barrel child, but he had a lot of friends whose parents did migrate to the US or Canada for work opportunities. And in sitting down and talking to Tijon, what was very interesting as far as cultural sensitivity goes was listening to how he adapted to ensuring that, because barrel children in the Caribbean, and particularly just being in Jamaica, we went to different parts of the country, not only in the capital of Kingston, but in the countryside. I went to Trelawney, I went to Monique, we went to a couple different places, was hearing Tijon say that I had to learn that I shouldn't bully my classmates because of this situation. And so that sparked something in me talking to him, and it sparked something in me because then I realized that for these children, as much as barrels represent something positive, then they got picked on because they may have had the best clothes or the best shoes, but they didn't have their parent there. So that became like a point of contention for them at school. And so for 12-year-old Tijan to say to me, well, I learned that I have to be kind, and I learned that I have to stand up for my classmates, and because they're going through a really hard time, they don't have their parent there to check their homework or to come to the football games or to take them to the school events. So that was one thing that really stuck with me, and that was one of my earliest interviews. So then as I spent more and more time in Jamaica, and then I, went to other places in Florida and New York, because the series not only looked at children who were left behind, but then also families that were reunited years later, was then how I ensured that although I send barrels and I know that they have a positive connotation, how to be really sensitive to the fact that for a lot of people they represent loss, or for a lot of people it represents separation, and it represents that they don't have their parent with them. And then the next thing and the final thing is, so in this picture, I'm with a young lady here. She's 7 years old. Her mom migrated to New York. She's been separated from her mother for about, at that point, it was about 2 years. And I learned in Jamaica, culturally as well, even though like I'm from a similar culture in the Caribbean, just understanding that for a lot of parents, telling their children, they didn't tell their children they were leaving. And at first I was really taken aback by that. But then I learned, of course, culturally, telling a child or letting a child know that people were afraid that it might jeopardize them being able to go, or that people might not, like telling someone would mess up their chances because someone would look on you and put negativity your way. So thinking about that from the sense of, okay, well, this is why this parent may not want to talk to me, or this is why this child doesn't want to say anything, I had to be really sensitive to that. And so to get the children to kind of feel more comfortable, I did things like, play with the puppets so that a child would be more comfortable, sit on the swing, just whatever I needed to do in order to ensure that they knew I was there to hear their stories, but not to hinder what was taking place. And I think that for me, as someone who's from the region, just understanding that even though I'm familiar with a lot of the things happening culturally, that I still had to take a step back and understand that I was looking at it through a different lens, because I had always seen the positivity in it. And at this point, not to only see it negatively, but to be sensitive to that in my reporting. And it definitely helped me as I ended up interviewing about 45 people overall, from children ages 7 to 18, and then caretakers, teachers, and then parents. So it really helped me to be sensitive to all the different things that would have affected them throughout. So I thank you for listening, and I definitely look forward to really getting into this conversation. I know that my fellow panelists have a lot of really great things to say as well.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you? It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here, and new colleagues, and hi, dear, how are you? And new colleagues as well. Let's see now. One more, okay. Yeah. As Holly pointed out, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. As Holly pointed out, I looked as part of my research into divisions in this country. I looked at something we rarely examine, something known as caste. Who's familiar with caste in at least a general sense? That's a good place to begin. I'm going to talk briefly about what my presentation involved in the context of this thing we call sensitivity. And I'm also going to take a quick, brief look at other examples of things we should be sensitive to, cultural sensitivity, culture in both a broad sense in a very specific sense regarding several stories. When I thought about the notion of caste in the United States, an idea that came to me as a result of first covering the Conference on Race and Discrimination in South Africa in 2001 for NPR, and then subsequently, and most profoundly, to being involved in a conference, going to a conference where caste was being discussed at Brandeis. This was 2016. There had not been many conferences on caste in the United States. This was among the first. I went to this conference and heard people talking about experiences in India, but also hearing them talk about experiences in the United States, facing casteism because of where they stood within the caste system. In this case, I was talking to folks who described themselves and are described as Dalits, a term that most folks were familiar with when it was referred to as untouchables. And now Dalits, which some interpret as broken people, suddenly there was this conference focused on this issue. It was further elucidated during a survey exposition last year. Last year, I'm losing track of time, where it was determined that in the United States, there was a great fear among people who live here, among the 3 million or more Indians in the United States. There was a fear that that which plagued them in India, being Dalits, would follow them in the United States. They had this fear of being outed, according to this survey by a group called Equality Labs. And so when Holly suggested, and Kim and others suggested, that we look at sensitivity and examine sensitivity, this was not new to me. And here you had a different subject matter, or a group of people, largely Dalits, but I begin any subject, any story, by focusing on the dignity of individuals. I don't think, to be sensitive, I think one of the first terms that comes to mind is dignity, and treating people with dignity, recognizing the dignity in people, recognizing the dignity in anyone you interview, and basically allowing that to manifest in your stories. This particular survey was important in that regard in approaching the very notion of caste in America.
This is WGBH's All Things Considered. I'm Barbara Howard. There are a lot of things that divide us these days: race and religion, gender and class. Something rarely discussed that separates millions in India has worked its way into the United States. It is caste, the religious and social hierarchy of Hindus. And Massachusetts residents of Indian descent are not free from its effects. Today, in partnership with the Pulitzer Center, we begin our series, Caste in America in India. WGBH Radio senior reporter Phillip traveled with a Boston area man to where that man's life began as a so-called untouchable.
After an 18-hour flight from Boston to Hyderabad, we're minutes away from landing in Nanded in the state of Maharashtra. Before touching down, let me take a moment to explain what it is that the guy next to me, Suraj Yenge, is returning to. It's a system called caste.
They begin with Brahmins, then there is Kshatriyas, the warriors, the Banyas, or what they call it Vaishya, the merchant class. The fourth is Shudra, the lower working class peasants. The fifth category, and that is the untouchable caste group. And these untouchable outcast groups are 180 million who do not get recognized.
Suraj Yenge is an untouchable. Yenge's family and friends greet him with bouquets of flowers and effusive smiles. Fitting for a Dalit in their view, who has accomplished what many here call the near impossible for a so-called untouchable. Not merely leaving Nanded, which very few do, but leaving to become a lawyer, a PhD, and a fellow at Harvard University, no less.
This was our house for good 20 years. We had a bed here. One day it rained. I saw my mom trying to put 3 buckets in different locations so the water drops don't fall on us. My entire life I slept like this. without realizing that mom and dad were dancing the whole night so that the waters don't fall on us and we might get distracted from our sleep.
The point of that, of course, at the beginning, at starting the entire series, was to basically create a multidimensional person. To introduce you to someone who whose life obviously takes on many aspects. He's not simply, as the stories illustrated, a Dalit. In other words, we wanted to know who Suraj Yinde is. This is true of course, all of journalism. But it was really important that you don't create a stick figure, a one-dimensional type of character who you're reporting on, that you see this person in all his or her manifestations as far as your story goes. And at the very beginning, to treat folks with dignity. I'm going to move on to some other stories and try to wrap up as quickly as I can. I've also covered over the course of my journalism a lot of stories on human trafficking, a lot on opiates, quite a few stories on folks behind bars. This man here is individual behind bars, someone who, when in the cultural context, if you will, you have to look again at culture in a broad sense, and zero in on cultural sensitivities. There's probably fewer things as sensitive as folks behind bars, and the issues that they're dealing with, which include shame, which include sometimes bravado. Sometimes they're outspoken about what they've done in ways that don't involve shame. In fact, involve braggadocio. But it's important, even in all those aspects, to consider these individuals as full-bodied, non-stick-figured entities. This gentleman, after a lot of basically sitting down and talking with him about his story, decided to talk with me about his story. The point is that he was pleased that I was interested in talking with him beyond the fact that he was someone who had been exposed, dealing with, and shaped by the opiate crisis, in his words. But this fellow John, and that's his name, was intrigued by the fact that I was intrigued by his story. And I genuinely was. It wasn't simply a point of getting an interview. I was genuinely intrigued by his story. I won't go into all of it because we don't have the time. The same thing is true with individuals I interviewed in a women's section of this facility, Suffolk County House of Corrections. And with photos and with the storytelling itself, again, the point is to focus on the dignity of these individuals. This is going back to Nanded. I love this photo, and I love the story behind this photo. We didn't get a chance to tell all these stories in the Cast in America series, but again, beginning in India, I wanted to show both in photos and in audio. Mainly an audio reporter, but I love photography. I wanted to show, again, the dignity of youth. And this young man portrayed that in ways that are, I think, very obvious. You can see it in his eyes. Someone who's talking about a future in a place where many people don't think a future exists, in a Dalit slum, so-called, one of the poorest areas of the area called Nanded, where I visited. But this young man is on his way to graduating from what do you call it? Elementary school. I don't know what you call it in India, but it's from elementary school, and this was his proud day. This is a slide of a young man who I interviewed for a series called The Games of Nantucket. I know that is a crazy title, isn't it? But if you're familiar with Nantucket, a resort area off the coast of Massachusetts, But I'm just going to go back for a second. But this young man, Henry Calderon, was accused of being a member of the 18th Street gang and accused of engaging in fights with MS-13 on the island of Nantucket. And as the series showed and as the investigation showed, none of this was true. But this is what he was saddled with, an ankle bracelet, which is following him, or which is part of his life at this very moment. And it was important for someone who did not want to, at the time, have his face shown, to basically introduce him in a different way, to show what he is dealing with on a day-to-day. And what he's dealing with on the day-to-day is having his activities monitored, so on and so forth, an ankle bracelet. This is one of my favorite photos and also part of the story, the gangs, I'm sorry, don't want to confuse those, Caste in America, again in Nanded. This fella is someone who cleans sewers. And one of the things he said is he did not want his daughter cleaning sewers. He did not want his family engaged in the same occupation he had been confined to, confined as a result of caste in India. And you can see the look on her face looking toward her father. He is someone who feels that he cannot go any further in life. This is a Nanded area where a group called the Young Panthers, the Dalit Panthers, where they basically work and live. And this young man to the right is a member of the Dalit Panthers. Speaking of the Caribbean, I'm trying to get through these as fast as I can, so forgive me. I love this photo. This was a story I did in Antigua about a man who is very, very ecstatic, and James is his name, and was very willing to say how he is willing to take money from tourists. And I won't go into the details of the story, but I just, again, love the fact that he was so full of life, but also like so explicit about what he does for a living. Quite interesting. This is a story as part of a series which just won the Edward R. Murrow, National Edward R. Murrow Award, by the way, for investigative reporting, called the Illicit Business of Massage. And in looking and thinking about sensitivity, obviously those who might engage in that type of activity do not want their faces shown. And it was important in approaching this story and how I got to this guy and others in this story, men who are customers who basically visit illicit massage parlors, was I visited or sat down for over several weeks with his therapist, with a therapist, a sex therapist. And the sex therapist said that these men do not want to talk with you, Phillip. There's no way. But give me time, and I'll get you on the phone with one of these guys. I sat on the phone with him back and forth for about 3 weeks before he agreed to talk. And in this context, he agreed to talk anonymously. And that's why, of course, he's portrayed in this photo anonymously. I'm going to speed through these because I'm going to leave you with this photo right here. Again, the whole notion of dignity. It must be part of your story about anyone you interview. There are quite a few people who simply will not talk with you. And this has been true, this was true for many of the Dalit people I interviewed. This woman here is a Dalit, so-called untouchable. She spoke with me extensively after I sat down with her. No audio, no notepad, absolutely nothing. and simply had a discussion with her with a translator about her life. That's what people want to know. They want you to know who they are and not to know them as a stick figure, as a stereotype, as a prototype, as any type of type. They want you to know them as human beings, full-bodied. And that's important, of course, in the portrayal, whether it be in photography, whether it be in audio, whether it be in the print interpretation of reality. They want you to know them as full-bodied, dignified human beings, and that's how I approach these topics, whether it be in India, the United States, Kenya, or wherever I've traveled, whether I'm focused on human trafficking or talking with folks about opiates behind bars. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Ewing. I'm a digital video journalist for National Geographic, so welcome to our building. So I have reported on a wide variety of topics that have really required a lot of sensitivity. The Muslim community in America, the autistic community, maternal mortality here in DC, wildlife trafficking, gender reassignment surgery of a teenager for a gender issue. But I'm going to focus today on the maternal mortality story that was part of our January issue. One thing that all of these stories have in common is, and Phillip touched on this a little bit, trust. Gaining trust with the people who you are reporting on. And I really don't like to use that phrase, reporting on, and the reason why is that as a journalist, I feel like a lot of our jobs is to not report on something. When you say that, it really creates a barrier between you and the subject, especially if it's a community that is underserved, underrepresented, or stereotyped. What I like to think of when I'm doing these kind of stories is reporting with the community. What are their needs? What have other outlets done wrong? What have they gotten wrong? What have they gotten right? What are things that they're talking about but that we as the audience aren't hearing or not talking about? So for the maternal mortality story, I was assigned to this magazine story, and the photographer was Lindsay Adario. She did a fantastic job laying a lot of groundwork all over the country. And as a national organization, an international organization, it was a really rare opportunity for us to really look into our own backyard, into DC, particularly Ward 7 and 8, where there is a stark difference in poverty level, education level, crime, and report on something that felt really local. And we approached this story in a community that Lindsay had already laid a lot of groundwork in. So essentially there is a really huge difference in maternal mortality rates in white women and women of color. I'm sure you all heard of the Serena Williams story. There are a lot of racial prejudices and things that go ignored that lead to pregnant women dying of very preventable things a lot of the times. So we went to this organization called Mama Toto, and they are a group of women who are largely from the community, who act as doulas or birth assistants for women of color, and a lot of them do it totally pro bono. They don't have to pay a dime for it, and it's a very affordable, wonderful service that they provide. So we went into this community, and of course our goal was to find a woman who was using the service and tell her story and ultimately film her giving birth, hopefully successfully. That's probably one of the most sensitive moments in time that I can think of, having a camera in the room with you while you are giving birth. So and then all of the complications that came along with that. So we spent a lot of time without cameras, without notepads, as you alluded to, gaining trust in the community, just sitting in, just listening, talking with people. We made it a point to have an all-woman crew, and have someone who was from DC, from Anacostia actually, to be the DP. And that was really, really important because there was already inherent trust there, that they knew what we knew what we were talking about, and we understood the struggles and the challenges that they're going through. Something that we wanted to make sure was that, as kind of an inside joke, a big J journalist, we want to make sure that the subjects aren't saying things that they think that we want to hear. We want to make sure that they trust us enough to really say what's on their mind. And when the camera is on, you can get two types of interviews. You can get the PR interview where they're just saying what they think that you want to hear. They're not opening up at all. I'm sure you've all had that experience. Or you can get the confessional where it's super real. You're really listening to them. You're not preparing your next question. You're not focusing on what the sound guy is doing, anything like that. And you're really listening to them. And it's like everything else fades away. And that was the goal of this project. And eventually we found our main character in the film, and it took a lot of time of me and the DP like hanging out at her house, and she would just fall asleep and we would sit there and getting dinner and like getting coffee, and then eventually she felt like she could trust us enough to not only let us interview her, but the other hard part that we really wanted her to understand was that the impact of her telling her story. So not only the benefit that, other women who are struggling with this would be able to hear her story and maybe seek help and open up and feel like they can talk about it and that there are solutions out there, but I think something that a lot of us take for granted is having our subjects understand what their story being on the internet is or broadcasted. And we really worked hard to make sure that she understood the implications of this, that people could like look this up and this would be on the internet forever. And that was really something that was important to us for her to understand, and that she eventually came around to understand. And it made her want to tell her story more. And so I think kind of the takeaway here is really gaining trust outside of the camera lens with your subjects, and ultimately that will make your story better. It might lead to more stories and reporting with communities instead of on communities. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much and just point out that two of the women who worked with you on that maternal health project were Pulitzer grantees. So
Yes.
Asha Stewart and also Lindsay Adaria.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's the kind
They're
of,
great.
even at mainstream organizations like yours, sometimes support is needed to be able to tell these more niche, extremely important, deep stories that don't get told otherwise. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you for using it.
Of course, yeah. Asha was such an amazing asset, and she had so much support, and she's also an MG grantee. And Lindsay, of course, is a superstar, and it was so wonderful working with them. And we had a wonderful editor, Rebecca Barless, who edited the piece. And I think the colorist was a guy, but we kind of let him slide. Thank you.
Good morning. I don't have photos also. Sorry about that. So as mentioned, my name is Jacqueline Charles. Call me Jackie. Everyone's fine with you. So I cover Haiti the last couple of weeks, actually last 6 weeks. I have basically been covering an uprising there It's not getting a lot of focus in the U.S. press, but basically there's been violent protests. We could say every week. Schools were supposed to open on September 9th, but they have not been able to open, so 2 million kids have not been able to go to school since September 9th. I actually have a second Pulitzer grant to work on the anniversary of the earthquake that's coming up. And for me, the biggest challenge has been trying to figure out when to go, because we need to be able to get around, and streets are barricaded, towns are barricaded. There's a section of the country that is completely cut off. There's a humanitarian crisis that's building where hospitals don't have fuel and having to decide, who should get the last tank of oxygen that they have. And in some places, they've completely run out of oxygen. So that is, where we are. And I was actually there last month doing some pre-reporting for my Pulitzer project. And this is when things were starting, and it was first a fuel shortage where you couldn't get fuel. And then I remember walking out of one interview, and then I was going to go meet somebody, and he says, "Oh, you can't come because they just started burning tires in front of our buildings." So that has basically been my life for the last couple of weeks. But I've been covering Haiti for a long time, and I am confronted with the issue of cultural sensitivity every time. I am partly Haitian, but I have to remind myself that I'm Haitian, but I don't live in the country. I live in the U.S. I have the luxury of having a passport. I can go and come as I please, and most of the people that I'm dealing with, they do not have that luxury. So this is something that you always have to remind yourself, that you get to leave, they have to stay. And so whatever you do, you can, have a huge impact. And I always tell people, whether it's another journalist or it's somebody who wants to do good, you have to think of this country as sort of a blind man. This blind man, you walk in, you see him, and you may feel sorry for him, but he has figured out how to get around his environment before you. And if you go in and you start moving furniture around, it may be great and wonderful as long as you're there. But if you're not going to be there for the long run, and if you intend to leave, then what have you done? You've upset his life, you've given him hope that you can't fulfill, and you've changed everything, and it actually probably have made matters worse. So I always like to tell people that, and especially for journalists, somebody's going to come after you. And I've seen a huge change after the January 12, 2010 earthquake. A lot of people went in, a lot of NGOs went in, gave people a lot of false promises. And so for those of us who've been trying to get stories, it's also very difficult. So for me, oftentimes the first thing is gaining the trust of the subjects, and I have to tell them over and over and over again, listen, I am not going to make any promise to you that you telling me your story is going to change your life. But if you have a problem and people don't know that you have a problem, then there's no possibility of something changing. And you have to keep stressing that over and over again, because as much as you tell them, they're so desperate that sometimes they hear something else, but you have to continue to do that. You cannot give false hope. The other thing is judgment. You have to be careful not to come into a situation and bring your own judgment into the situation, and not even have that judgment show up in your face. Because if you're talking to people, especially in my situation, often these people are very, very poor, and they have made decisions based on their circumstance. And I can't bring my moral values or my way of life or my way of thinking to it, so you have to pull back, and you always have to be aware of that. And just to give you just a couple of examples of what I've been in. So you were talking about maternity, and I remember a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, we were contacted by a nurse who was working with Doctors Without Borders about a maternity clinic, and we went in to do the story. So what happens is a lot of women get pregnant around Carnival, because you know what happens with Carnival, right? Mm-hmm. So 9 months after Carnival is when the birth rate really expands in Haiti. And this clinic, which was supported by the international community, was about to close because there was no funding. So we went in there, and they were going to give us full access. Literally women, not just one, not just two. We're talking about scores of women having babies in this maternity hospital with no epidural, nothing, literally on the floor in a bed. The babies were flying. I'm telling you, they were flying. So imagine you're a photographer. I mean, it doesn't get better than this, right? You have full access, and you're taking pictures. And I remember when the pictures got in, and the editors were all so excited. And in one instance, you could see personal stuff in terms of women. And I said, we can't run that picture. And we had a huge, big debate in the newsroom about this. And the photographer was like, this is art. I said, no, it's not. I said, if this was your wife at a public hospital in Miami and she was this exposed, you would have a problem with this. And this was the thing, I was very sensitive about this issue. Just because somebody gave us the access, it does not mean that you don't protect their dignity, in this. And we kept going back and forth, back and forth. We settled on a compromise, but I still was not happy with the compromise, and the picture showed up on the front page. And we heard from readers, So interesting enough, so that was 2008, and that was a year that Haiti had 4 back-to-back hurricanes and storms in 30 days. So, so a couple of months after that photo, we had a situation where with the hurricane that a lot of babies were killed and they were drowned. And I actually was taken to a place and there were just at least 24 babies had been laid out on concrete and they looked like porcelain dolls, but they were all dead. And so because of the issue that I raised the last time, there was a discussion about whether or not we should put these pictures on the front page and what should we do. And in that setting, I will tell you, it was the father of one of the dead babies who actually pulled my photographer and wanted him to take this photo of him holding up his dead child, and the discussion I had with the bosses is that, what, people are not gonna like this, but we have to show this so that people understand the tragedy and how horrible this, this was. But again, in that situation, when we were approaching people to talk about it, at first I introduced myself and then see if they want to talk. If they don't want to talk, you don't force it, you don't go and just bombard your way. And so we did run those pictures, on the front page. A couple of years later, I was doing a piece about abortion and 2 girls clinging for life after they had botched abortions. And one of those girls she basically ended up getting pregnant because she needed to pay for school, so she went and got a boyfriend, and she actually did a whole interview and everything, and I think the guy just got her pregnant on purpose. And there's not a lot of things that shakes me, but that story, here's what almost happened to her just because she wanted an education. But again, and in that situation, it was like, you can't pass your judgment. Even the questions that you ask, they can't be so probing that you're making a judgment call, but they have to be in a way that you respect this person's dignity and let them tell you their story, and you try to translate that in your stories and also in your images. The last couple of stories I will tell you. So I spoke about Julie last night, who was part of the Pulitzer supported project I did about cancer in Haiti last year. So when I arrived at Julie's house last month when he was dying, inside the house, all the furniture was out. Everything was gone. So he was just laying on the ground, and there was no bed, there was nothing. And his family didn't have much to begin with, but the last time I was there was at least a twin bed. There were things, in the corner. All of their belongings were packed up in the corner. And when I got there, it was completely empty. And I'm Haitian, right? And I'm like, what is this? And I'm saying this to myself. And even later, I expressed this with, people that I know and even know the family. I said, what is this? I walk in there and there's nothing there. What's going on, And, people have their beliefs, especially in Haiti, people from the countryside. They believe in mystic. They believe that bad omens and things like that. And so I later, and I'm talking to different people, and they say, oh, that's some old practice that people outside that they have, or they think that the person is dying and their spirits are gonna, have a negative impact. Or a friend of mine last night who's a Haitian journalist, he says, no, people do that so that when people come to the house, they don't walk off and steal things. I'm like, but they don't have anything. He says, yeah, but the little stuff they have, they don't. But I needed to understand that, but I did not in that moment have this conversation with the mother. Well, why would you do this? And, this doesn't make any sense. And you need to get into the modern times. No, I was personally shaken by that, but I had to remind myself, this is their belief. This is how they are. So you now have to deal with it within the scope of that. Same thing when I was there last month and I was doing my pre-reporting on my project. I went into a tent city where people literally have been living there for the past 9 years, and just the situation it was awful. I mean, it was a very tough existence, you know. But you're asking people, okay, so what is it like living here, as opposed to why are you still living here? You know, you just have to be very careful in terms of how you frame your questions, you know, how you approach it, and just remember that for these people, sometimes there's no other choice. And what you want to do is to get their stories and then put their stories in the context of their environment, not what your expectations are, or you know what you're used to. So for me, that's what it's, you know, in terms of always being culturally sensitive, because yes, I'm Haitian, but my circumstances are different from theirs, and I have to remember that. And so we might as well be two different people, and so you always have to be sensitive to their needs and to their issues. All right, thank you guys.
Good morning. My name is Jaime Joyce. I'm executive editor at Time for Kids. We are Time Magazine's children's edition. First of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I really enjoyed meeting so many students last night and hearing about your projects. It's really inspiring to hear from you and the work that you're doing, and really makes me excited about what you will continue to do. So thank you for being here this weekend. I want to talk to you about working with children and interviewing children. As Holly explained in her introduction, one of the projects I did was working with children, talking with children of incarcerated parents and their families. So it's one of the projects that Pulitzer Center has supported. One of the first projects I did, I'll just give you a little background about some of the stories that I've done for Time for Kids. The first story I did was traveling to Kenya to the Kakuma refugee camp and telling a story for young readers, and our main readers are between like 8 and 12 years old, and really helping them to understand what it means to be a refugee and what life is like in a refugee camp. And this is a camp where many of these children, they've been born there. Their parents have been born there. It's a camp that's been there for decades. So introducing that concept, that idea to children, and Pulitzer Center has, you know, allowed Time for Kids to do that, which was really a unique opportunity. The other project I did, again, was the incarcerated parents, and so it's traveling with kids and families on a bus, and then spending time with kids at a summer camp where they're going to visit their moms at a federal correctional institution. So there's a lot of sensitivity involved in that, cultural and otherwise. I've also traveled to Bangladesh, to the Rohingya refugee camps, and meeting with children in schools there. And then the most recent project I've done is looking at the migration crisis, so traveling to Honduras to find out and to explain to our young readers why children and families are leaving Central America. And then the second part of that story is looking at what happens when you get to the United States. So it was, I just returned from Tijuana and San Diego earlier this month. So much of my work is, you know, I'm talking to children, and part of that, we've heard the word trust come up quite a bit, and that's really important to establish that trust with children and their parents when you have that opportunity. So I'll just sort of give you some ideas, like when I've gone into the field. First of all, one of the first things I do is I don't just start with reporting. It's sort of observing, hanging back, watching the kids in their natural environment. Maybe it's at their school, maybe it's at a community center, and just letting them get comfortable with who's this new person in the room. Oftentimes, you know, kids are really naturally curious, so they'll approach you and they'll see me with my, I typically don't have a photographer traveling with me, so I've just got my iPhone in my pocket. And sometimes I'll show kids, I'll ask them if it's okay if I take a picture, number one. It's really important to ask permission. And then show them the picture. They love flipping through the photographs and seeing themselves, and they're just completely delighted oftentimes to see themselves reflected in my iPhone. That's really fun for them. And so it's just a lot of that, just getting comfortable. I also will begin any interview, anytime I'm talking with kids, really just explaining to them what I'm doing and who I'm writing for. I want them to know that I'm writing for kids, other children, and I want to have their perspective. So I want to enlist them as partners in this storytelling so that they're helping other kids understand what their experience is. And then it's also really important to, I like to make sure that children and their parents and whoever I'm talking to has a chance to ask questions of me. What questions do you have for me? What are you curious about? What do you want to know? You know, for example, when I was in Honduras and in Mexico, you know, these are kids families who are coming to the they want to be in the United States. So I'll give them time to ask me questions about what it's like to live in the U.S. They want to know, what does it look like? What are people like there? And, you know, for example, when I was in Tijuana, I brought a map of the United States, Mexico, Central America, and to kind of orient them and say, where am I? Here's where I'm from, and here's where I live. Here's where I'm from in Arizona. Here's where we are right now. And okay, can you find where you're from? And sort of engaging them in that way so that they're comfortable and they want to talk to you and they don't see you as sort of an interrogator, but you're a partner and you're interested in them as people. So in terms of, and also just when you're talking to kids about really sensitive topics, in Honduras, I'm talking to kids, many of them, their families have migrated, or their parents rather have migrated, so they might be living with a grandparent or other family members. So I always want to make sure that they know that they can stop at any time. It's okay if they don't want to answer a question, that's okay. Just want to make sure that, you know, be sensitive to the fact that they understand that they don't have to talk to me. You know, if they want to stop at any point, it's okay. And you want them to feel comfortable enough you just want them to put them at ease so they don't feel like you're the adult and they have to tell you. And that, I think, sort of opens up a lot of pathways to conversation with young people. So I could go on and on, but we have a panel. So I'll leave it at that. And I welcome your questions, and I really look forward to hearing from all of you during the rest of this morning. So thank you very much.
Great, so I just want to start by saying thank you again for your informative stories, your advice. I'm sure it's really helpful to a lot of fellows here today. And we have, I think, half an hour, so I don't know, I might skip over my question just so you guys can ask questions. So does anyone want to start? Yes.
Hello, my name is Cami Banky and I represent Elon University. My question is, it's pretty much for all of you, anyone can answer. I'm wondering, since you all talked about developing trust with people you're interviewing, the people that you met, I'm wondering how that continues after you've done your reporting project and after the interviews. Really briefly, I did my reporting project in Rwanda, and something I tried to be really aware of was that I didn't want to just be another young journalist that came and just left. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to maintain that trust after you've done the reporting.
Says on? Okay. That's a very tricky balance, you know, because you have to remember you're a reporter. I mean, there may be people that you will meet in your career or through a project that you eventually develop a relationship with outside of reporting, but you don't want to become this person that they are dependent on. So it's something that I am very attuned to, and I guess I can come across as being kind of cold or insensitive. But, you know, I mean, people always say, you know, how do you balance it? You see so much misery, so much death, like, you know, how do you deal with it? And I think with me, in terms of dealing with it, is I always try to keep, you know, an arm's distance. And I'm thinking in particular about a woman that I met after her earthquake, and she was living in one of the camps in front of the palace. And it's always hard for me to find somebody who's in a situation that it's not great and they can really articulate the situations. Oftentimes, like with Haitians, we say they're the Maroons, they talk by not talking. So when you find somebody and they're like a quote machine and they can go deep, you're like, oh my gosh, I got to use this person on, a broader story or something. So I met this woman, she was so great, and I did a story about her living in the situation. And then a couple of months later, she was actually invited to the presidential inauguration after the elections. And so I followed up and I did another story with her. And, and her circumstances were tough. And then at some point, though, her boyfriend told her, you shouldn't be giving information for free. And so then it became like, well, you need to give me something. And I'm like, I'm not going to give you anything. And we don't pay for stories. It just changed the nature and the dynamic of the relationship. And so for me, the trust was broken, but it was her breaking my trust. And then I just had to push back. The other day I reached out to somebody else I had met in terms of my earthquake reporting, and I just wanted to catch up on her from my project possibly. But then she kept calling me, and then I realized it's not because you want to talk to me, but that level of desperation. So it's a very fine balance, and you don't want people to feel like you're using them and you only use them for that story and for that moment. So you can drop in from time to time and you can check on them, but you just always have to make it clear that you're not going to be the cash machine, the ATM machine, the support, and that's my constant battle. I don't know what it is for you.
I mean, I think it's really challenging. I think it's a great question. Often people will always ask, can you send me that story when it's done? And so that's, I think, really important. I'm not always great at it, I'll admit. Sometimes things get really hectic. But I think if you can do that and share with them so they see the results of the work and what that means, that's a really nice thing that you can do. And that shows that you care and you value their contribution to your work. So I'll leave it at that.
And just to add to that, I just want to say that, you may develop your, trust with your sources and send that follow-up story, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they may quote unquote be happy with it, but that's okay. Yeah. Because your job is to, do the story justice, not necessarily, make someone happy. So I had this situation happen where, I explained thoroughly several times what the story was going to be about, because the term Beryl Child is actually a taboo term, right? And people look at it as something very negatively in the Caribbean because you're saying that a parent is leaving their child behind. They don't want, and the thing is, parents are doing this for their children, not, to do anything to harm them. They're doing this to help their families, but people look at it as abandonment. So I had a situation happen where after the first part of my series came out, there was, people who were not happy with it, people who were not happy with photographs being used. Although we had photographic releases done, as a precaution, although we had the language that said, like, you did understand this, although we had several conversations without any cameras, notebooks, everything, there were people who were not happy. But to know that you did not break the trust in that because you did explain and you did everything right, but then being willing, even though, it was some tense conversation, still being willing to follow up and not ignoring those emails or those phone calls, and being able to have those tough conversations and explain why, hey, I understand what this means to you culturally, but here is why we were not putting a red, letter or a red X on this person's back, but in the context of the story, this is why we had to explain it in such a way. So this is not gonna negatively impact you, throughout years and years, but this is why we explained it in this context. And I thought that was something really important for me to understand, and not take it personally, but understand that I still did my due diligence. And I worked through, so the one of the main people that I worked through was Dr. Claudette Crawford Brown, who's a sociologist. She's the woman who actually coined that term, about 30 years ago, and she coined it as a means to bring attention to the issue and to help children, and she's done work across the world, not just the Caribbean region on it, but understanding that from her perspective it was done to bring light to it and attention to it. But of course, culturally for some people it's negative, but then trying to find that middle balance.
I'm just going to add just very, very, very briefly, thank you, that I'm in touch with a lot of people I've interviewed. Some of it's through Facebook. And I can name two examples. One, direct relationship to my Pulitzer-sponsored project on CAST. I've been in touch with folks in India and some in the United States who ask questions, who tell me, I'm following up with a fella in New York who worked at a restaurant who described in one of the reports how he had been forced to sit in one part of the restaurant by himself because of his caste status, while others were sat at another part of the restaurant. But what I'm careful about in a lot of this correspondence is not being turned into, if you will, a propaganda tool for empathy. There's empathy, and then there's also the possibility, Jacqueline pointed out, you have to be careful to draw the line of not basically becoming part of the story, the reporter becoming an asset, if you will, in the story. I'm in touch also with a fellow named Bill. He's a white working class man in Youngstown, Ohio, a story I've been working on, Trump supporters, and I'm in touch with him because of his health. He is someone who is currently in the hospital, and I've been in touch with him and his family, just checking on his condition and seeing how he's doing and so on and so forth. So that type of thing is follow-up, but not crossing a line into where you become part of the story in any way that would be considered propagandistic, if you will.
Hi, I'm Rafael Lima from Wake Forest University, and Mrs. Catalin she touched on it a little bit, but I would like to know how do you kind of walk the boundaries of providing the content and reporting and making people aware of the issue, but at the same time respecting some very sensitive affairs for some of the subjects you work with, and if you have any advice for that.
Again, you're gonna leave. So what's the impact? The person who's talking to you, does this individual truly understand what they're saying, what the impact could be? And I'm thinking two examples. In my series, my Pulitzer Center supported series, one of the part of the package dealt with cervical cancer and why women in Haiti were dying of a disease that's curable. And one of the women that I interviewed, and she later passed away, was basically talking about how her husband was at fault. That cervical cancer is a sexually transmitted disease, and she was talking about about his extracurricular activities and all of this. And when I talked to her one-on-one, she was very open about it. And then later we had to go back and interview her, and then the husband joined the interview. And so when I was very sensitive not to ask her questions down this line of questioning there, and I saw that him joining the interview wasn't so much to be supportive, I felt was to see what she was going to say. But her belief was also so central to her struggle and her cancer story, that when we wrote the story, there was no way to kind of write around it. I mean, you had to put it in there. But I felt, it was tough. And I think that was one of the stories we did translate, in French. And then I wanted to share the story with her, but at the time she was so sick and he had her phone, and I just would not send the story. But it's something, again, you're the reporter, you know, and it wasn't, and it was something that she kept coming back to over and over again, and it was like, do you understand what you're saying? So it was no way around it. And I mean, and I remember a couple of years earlier, I had a similar incident where after the earthquake, I was following this woman who was among the women who were basically driving the heavy equipment, and they were the people who were picking up the dead bodies. And she was talking, and the story was about how women are empowered because they have a job. And she was telling me how, unlike the rest of the women that she worked with, she was not a victim of domestic abuse, you know, and this job had not changed her life in a negative. And the story was that most of the women who were working in this government agency called CNE, the equipment, like a lot of them became victims of domestic abuse because now they were working, and the Haitian men couldn't, you know, deal with it. Well, later on in reporting, guess what? It turned out she was a victim of domestic abuse. As she and I became closer and she became more comfortable and trusting in me, she ended up confiding that not just was she a victim, but one morning her husband tried to kill her. And her husband was a police officer. So how do I approach this? Because the story, the profile I'm presenting is of this strong, independent woman who is so proud of the fact that she's not like the other women that she worked with. And, you know, and she doesn't have this man basically telling her what to do, and it's an equal relationship. But in fact, as the story evolves, it turns out she was. It was hard to get around that, but I end up having to put that in there. I mean, I was very sensitive on some of the details. She knew that it was going to go in, but what she did not expect was that the local Haitian press was going to take my story, translate the story, put it on a radio, and now everybody knows her business. And I'm like, oh my God, and if this woman ends up having issues because of me, well, long story short, the husband was related to a mayor, and somebody basically from the palace called this mayor and says, if, you know, something happens to this woman, I'm holding you responsible. And I think it also helped that Bill Clinton later recognized her by giving her an award of courage. But it's things like that, you know, you're in that balance of you're doing your job, you're talking to people, and you have to understand, as Melissa said, over and over and over again. And at the end, you have to stay as true to the story as you can without putting people's lives in danger, clearly. But you have to tell your reader the whole story. I could not continue the story to present her as a woman who was not a victim of domestic abuse, because that was part, you know, of the story. So it's just it's always a balance, I feel.
And I think you also want to make sure that when you're interviewing people and you're dealing with sensitive topics, I deal a lot with mental health, and that entire series I worked on in Jamaica focused on the mental health impact. And so what I did for a lot of my interviews, particularly with the children, was I had a social worker or a psychologist that had worked through some of the school programs that these children attended, present at all times. And I did that as a precaution, but I saw how important it was that I did that when I was going to do an interview with a 12-year-old boy who, what they called it, reverse migration, because he was born in New York, but he was acting up in school, and so his mother said, I'm sending you to your grandparents in Jamaica, to his aunt and uncle in Jamaica, excuse me. And so I was going to go, interview this 12-year-old boy, and we left Kingston and we went to a part of Jamaica. We were just outside of Ocho Rios, and he ran away from home. And by the time we got there, we arrived, and his aunt and uncle are frantic. The police had just left, and they're just like hysterical. And you're taken aback by something like that. But then having Dr. Brown there, who has dealt with this kind of thing, on a regular basis, and was able to talk them down and really figure out some of the issues that were happening in the home and where he possibly could have gone, I thought was really important. And the follow-up there was, we did follow up to find, to find out what happened. And he was found, but he got in 2 parishes away in Jamaica, which was 3 hours away from his home. But again, it was due to the fact that he felt abandonment issues, which was something she touched on so many times. And then feeling like he wasn't loved or wanted, even though his aunt and uncle were like, no, we're here for you. So I felt what it showed me a lot, and what I do all the time when I'm working on these stories, is ensuring that I have those gatekeepers or those people that already have that experience in working with those issues, or that group of people who can serve as those people that help build that trust and can also work with you in a situation like that. So the reason why I was able to get such access into schools and into programs across Jamaica was because of people like Dr. Brown, and ensuring that I had their trust, because once I had their trust and they knew what I was there to do, then I was able to get the trust of a lot of other people. So I think that's a really important point, especially when you're dealing with sensitive issues, to work with people who are already doing the work and are in those communities, so that you're working with the community, as you mentioned.
I think it's really important to just do a little like looking up of your sources and your people who you're talking to, and even the people who you're working alongside with. I can't tell you how many times that someone has given me the perfect quote or the perfect interview, and then as soon as the camera turns off, they say some stuff that is not relevant, that is contradictory to what they've just said on camera, or I'll look up a source that I'm looking into, or a footage provider that I'm looking into. What do they say on Twitter? What do they say on Facebook? Check into those things because a lot of the time people will, present themselves to you as the journalist, as exactly, the person that you want them to be, and you have to be aware of that and kind of get out of your own narrative to make sure that this is the person who you're actually talking to, and they're not just feeding you what you want to hear.
Go to this side for a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, team over here. My name is Angelica Keke, and I'm representing the UC Berkeley School of Journalism. I had a question for Gabrielle. I really like what you said about reporting on the community, reporting with the community instead of on the community. But I wanted to know, because I'm like really into like community-based journalism and like immersing myself and things like that, but I wanted to know the boundaries that you kind of use with that. So whether you report with them of like, okay, this is what we need to focus on. Do you include them in any like post-production work? Meaning like, how, like what is your boundaries with that?
Yeah. So I think that the reporting that I did for another Lindsay Addario story, Muslims in America, for the Nat Geo magazine, was a really great example for this, because as soon as I started reporting in this community, everybody knew. Like every masjid that I went to, every community gathering that I went to, every like dinner that I went to, they already knew who I was and what I was doing, and they looked me up. So that's kind of one of the things that you have to be cognizant of when you're doing community reporting. Not that I don't think you would ever do this, but you have to make sure that your story is really consistent. You're very open with who you're talking to. If one group doesn't like another group, you have to, be aware of that. Any opinions that you may have shared at a dinner may get around very quickly. So you have to be really aware of that in particular. And then also, you have to be, I think Phillip raised a really good point of not being used as a propaganda tool, because communities who are underserved and underrepresented, you want to make sure that you're doing your job and asking them what have other outlets who maybe you've spoken to in the past, or like what articles do you read that you get really angry about, or that you really dislike? What do you not like about them? What do you think that they got wrong? What did they get right? And you have to just be like cognizant that when you ask that question, it's an opportunity for them. A lot of people are very truthful with you about, oh, I don't like this or that or whatever, or I'm sick of people talking about this issue. It's not something that we even talk about. You have to be aware that some people are view that question as an opportunity to give you kind of like a red herring, or like a something that is on their agenda. I was also very wary of like people my age who viewed this as a friendship relationship, or as not a journalistic relationship. Like finding me on Instagram and following me and messaging me and things like that. So that's another like pitfall that you have to be aware of, you know, having an honest conversation with yourself of like, okay, where do I want to draw the line? Is it okay for them to have my phone number? Like, is it okay for them to follow me on Instagram? Like, what's my preferred method of communication? Is it email, professional email only? And, you know, but being aware that when you draw those boundaries, it is a boundary. So some people, you know, who aren't hip to email might not, you know, be able to get in touch with you as easily, or they might prefer to call you on the phone. So I think that that's kind of the things that I am aware of when I'm reporting on communities like that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think just to add, like, how do you do any of like community with working with them in post-production at all? Like, do you
Right.
ask for the, you get what I'm saying? Like, where is your boundary with that?
So at Nat Geo, as an editorial organization, we have a pretty strict line with feedback in post-production, meaning that unless you're like an expert, like I'm doing this, we just released this story on plastic and shoes, and I sent a segment to the expert, and I was like, I want to make sure that when we're talking about polyurethane foam and how it got replaced by molded EVA, that we're saying it right. And then we have like things like that like I do not understand, like material science. Things like that we send to experts for feedback to make sure that we're getting the facts right. For things like, ooh, my hair doesn't look that great in that shot, or things like that, we draw a pretty like hard line. So there really wasn't any, when it's something like that, there's no real work in post-production. That's where the trust comes in up front. Like, is it okay to film this? Did I get your appearance release? Like, what are some things that I shouldn't film during this that you're not comfortable with? So when you go into post-production, you're already confident that you know the story and you have everything. Again, they may not like it, but the only real exception was the maternal mortality story, where we were like really, really wanted to make sure that she was comfortable with how much we filmed, where we cut certain things, what parts of her story we included. That was really the only exception because it was so sensitive and it was one person's story, not multiple people, not a community.
Okay, and I think we probably have time for one more question. Yeah, okay.
I'm Lily Moore Eisenberg. I go to Yale University, and I have a question for Jamie about informed consent with children. And I have a super brief anecdote from my own reporting that raised this question. And I think, yeah, so I'll just tell it. I was reporting on this community where a lot of children were temporarily orphaned because of an ice raid. And so both parents were often gone, and they were being taken care of by like older siblings, but they were often younger than 16 as well. And there was a Washington Post feature about this community, and one of the lawyers told me afterwards that one of the children had accidentally incriminated his mother by talking about them crossing the border illegally. And so for me, that raises the point that informed consent is important because, you know, the children, we need to preserve their dignity too, but it can also have like very severe legal implications. So how do you navigate that terrain, especially when you're reporting on people who have no adults present?
Most of the time, I'm glad you asked that question. It's a really important one. Most of the reporting that I've done, if the parent is not present, then there are other adults who are. So that might be the principal or the head of a school, that might be a social worker, that might be somebody in their community who has gotten the consent, who has spoken to, who's handled that piece of the story for me. But sometimes there are questions, a child might tell me something without their parent present. And I try to be really cognizant about the kind of, a child might say something to me and sure, they said it to me, but am I going to include that in my story? I try to be very careful about that because I do worry that okay, they said this, but this could be problematic for them down the road. They're a child, they don't understand the implications of that. So there's a lot I leave out. You have to be very selective in what you're including in your piece. Does that answer your question?
I just have one really
Sure.
practical follow-up, which is, would you just would you just stay away from any story about a child if there wasn't any adult present who could give consent?
That's tricky. Actually, last year when I was working as a mentor with some students, in fact, Holly, I think it was you and Brian. I mean, this came up because there were a lot of kids. This was a question that you had asked. You know, when there are kids, but there aren't adults present. You know, how do you ask those questions? That's tricky. I really would try to find the adult and probably try to really stay away from it. If they're telling me something sensitive, I wouldn't include it. You know, you could include other pieces that aren't sensitive, but when you're dealing with sensitive information, I would err on the side of caution. Would be my advice.
Great. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your questions quite yet, I'm sure our wonderful panelists would be willing to speak with you later throughout the day and this afternoon. But for the time being, can you just join me in thanking them? Thank you.